Writers Branding.
Hey, it's Benji Cole, son of Al Cole from CBS Radio and host of People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and successful people on the planet. Run to our website, peopleofdistinction.org for more info, or you can always email me directly at benji@alcoleenterprises.com. And on the line with us today, we have Edwin D. Armbruster. We'll be discussing his fantastic book, Unusual Attitudes, Flight Instructor Memoirs, available for purchase through Amazon.com. And guys, I will say that Edwin was brought to our network, People of Distinction, today by some of the best movers in the business, Writers Branding Publishing. So if you have a book that you'd like moved, do yourself a favor and contact Writers Branding. You can find out more information on them at writersbranding.com. Sit back, strap in, and get ready for a wild ride. Edwin, first and foremost, welcome to People of Distinction, and thank you so much for being a guest. How are you?
I'm fine, Benji, and thanks for interviewing me and having me on.
Absolutely. Well, listen, the pleasure is all ours, and we're very much looking forward to this. Let's jump right in. Unusual Attitudes, Flight Instructor Memoirs. Tell us a little bit more about your book.
The reason it's titled Unusual Attitude is because in the 50 years that I've been a flight instructor, now, mind you, this wasn't my primary vocation. I worked for the Panama Canal Company, Canal's own government, in Panama for 25 years. Anyway, I started a flying business when I went to work in Panama. It so happened that my first supervisor in an electronics shop was a flight instructor, the only one in the Republic of Panama, the American. Anyway, he got me started, and I became to get a pilot's license, and then I started teaching flying, and I've been a flight instructor for over 50 years. Through those 50 years, most of my stories take place in Central and South America, the Caribbean, and most with flight students who I've had incredible stories of survival. And I've actually had 2 airplane accidents that I literally crawled out of, and I burn up a hot air balloon on landing. I've got over probably around 15,000 hours of pilot and command time, and most of it, well, I'm going to say probably 8,000, 9,000 was instructing time, single engine aircraft mostly. I am multi-rated. I can fly anything I say with wings and engines. I'm a helicopter rated, and I'm what they call a gold sealed flight instructor. And I used to ask, what's a gold seal? Well, they said, well, I mentioned that in where they get a cup of coffee. That and $5 will get you a cup of coffee. I don't know. It was just one of those things that mark you as an distinctive flight instructor. Like I say, I've survived situations I should never survive, and that's what I write about in my book. There's so many, so varied and it's not a typical. How can I say? It's totally unusual. My stories are pretty much totally unusual. And then I talk about life in the Canal Zone. That's all gone now. Jimmy Carter destroyed that. So my book is, it's a big book. It's 500 some pages. Got lots of pictures in it. But the unusual attitudes, because the experience that I've had, when you talk about unusual attitude, there's instruments in an airplane that are called attitude instruments. And you use these attitude instruments when you're doing maneuvers, unusual maneuvers. So it's a play on words. It's not only unusual attitude with my students, and believe me, I've had many students that had how can I say, unusual attitudes. And it's quite funny. I used to teach a ground school, and I would select my students out of ground school before I'd started to actually give them flight training in a little airfield in Panama. I picked students that had a good sense of humor, could laugh at themselves. because I say we went in an hour and a half instruction. The first 45 minutes are going to be instructing. And then there's 15 minutes of whatever you want to do, we're going to do. We're going to have fun. I want you to, we're going to have so much fun that I want you to look forward to you coming out in your next lesson. I never heard for students. I always had people waiting in line to take instruction from me, even though there were other instructors available. But I was always accused also of picking the most beautiful women. And I said, well, there's something about women I like. But I said, I've had fun with a lot of ugly men, though. But anyway, my book is just a play on words because of the unusual attitudes of the airplane and unusual attitudes of personalities. It was a fun venture. Why? It's a combination of about 40 years of my first chapters I wrote 40 years ago.
Now, we know that the book is littered with all of these stories, but if you can please share with our listening audience maybe one or two of them so we can have a little bit more of an understanding of exactly what to expect, or maybe even a little bit more of a teaser, we would greatly appreciate it, Edwin.
There's several things that are totally unusual, and one of them was we were flying up from Panama. I had a family plane that's called a Cessna 205. It was a 6-place airplane. I have 4 daughters. And at the ages at this event, when we were flying up for 2 months of traveling around the States on vacation, the ages of my youngest was 5 years old. She had the very back seat. And then there was 10, 12, and 14, and then my wife and I. And between... I love flying at night in the States. Of course, in Panama, you don't fly at night. There's jungle, and that's about it. But I love flying at night because generally it's cool at night. But we were coming up, and we left Lafayette, Louisiana, headed for Mobile, Alabama. And I took my kids, I said, we're going to fly over New Orleans so they could see the New Orleans at nighttime. It was a clear night, and it was a beautiful night. We could see ball games going on in the stadium. We could see boats in the Mississippi, and then we headed out toward Pass Christian, headed to Mobile. And off in the distance, we're at 9,500 feet. And off in the distance, there's this red glow. And I said, gee, that's interesting. And it was either stationary, moving very slowly. And as we got closer and closer, it took on a shape. And it was an oval, or like an upside-down dish, red on top, fiery red on top, but clear on the bottom. And I'll never forget my wife saying, when we got within maybe a mile of it, she said, isn't that pilot on the wrong altitude? There should be 1,000 feet separation. I said, honey, that's not an airplane. And she said, what is it? I said, I have no clue. And then one of my daughters got it. Said, Dad, what is that? I said, I don't know. And another one said, oh my gosh. Anyway, we came so close. I was getting ready to push the controls down and just dive to get out of it. When it turned, it didn't bank like an airplane. There were no wings. It turned and then just disappeared. The red light, anyway. There was no windows, no lights, and like I say, when it just changed directions and then my 5-year-old in the back, what she remembers was a ball of fire. She thought it was a ball of fire that we were coming toward. Back then, this was in 1971. You didn't say anything. And then when I got back to Panama, about 7 or 8 months later, there's 3 UFOs came right in over the canal zone. Policemen saw it at nighttime and then another time during the daytime. So low that I'm going to say maybe 500 feet up above you. And I had an 8-year-old girl that saw one draw me a picture of what she saw, and a red oval with a crown, and I said, that's exactly what we saw. But anyway, that's one of the stories. And I had a story, I'm just glad there's many people cited it in Panama. And it's interesting. I know they've got this television program, Area 51 or something, about ongoing, but I have never been contacted, and I don't know if any of these policemen or people saw this UFO in Panama. It hovered right over the governor's mansion. I had a policeman, a friend of mine, on duty at the governor's house, and he said, Ed, this thing was no more than 200 or 300 feet above the governor's mansion in Balboa. But anyway, that's just one of the stories, and another one's the Bermuda Triangle. Flying with some friends. He had his own airplane. I was flying another plane for a friend of mine, going up through the Caribbean to the States and across the States. And my friend was flying 172, which was a little bit slower. I was flying a 182. And he took off before me on one of the, because normally we catch up in passing. And I looked up and I said, Jim, this is when we were in south, headed in the Caribbean in the Bermuda Triangle. And I said, Jim, an airplane up a couple thousand feet up above us, but going in the wrong direction. And I said, make some turns. He made some turns. I said, that's you. I said, what's your compass heading? He said, 330. I said, that's what my compass heading is, in 330. I made turns, and our compass both read 330, but he's going 30 degrees different from what we are. Finally, this went on for several days, and I said, Jim, you turn in 30 degrees to the left, because if my compass is wrong, we'll hit some islands, we'll hit Florida. If I turn and follow you and your compass is wrong, we'll be going out to sea. There's a magnetic field, and we experienced this for 2 days until we got close to Fort Lauderdale. Then his compass righted, and he had his compass checked, and that's the Bermuda Triangle, mystery of the Bermuda Triangle. And there are a number of other exciting stories. Oh man, I can tell you about flying with students. I've had actually one of my students, engine blow up in southern Mexico in instrument conditions. And the engine kept running. The valve went through the engine. We're in the clouds, and there was just climbed above the highest mountain in our route, headed to the States. When all of a sudden, I heard this snapping thing, loud vibration, engine making a terrible racket. And the engine kept running, but we lost altitude, and we're down in the clouds now. It's lower than the peaks of mountains that we were headed for. Anyway, I said we had got to head out to sea because we had prepared a ditch. And the engine ran for another. It's an incredible story of survival. And we got to Minatitlán, Mexico. Oh, that's where we took off from. We got to Veracruz, where we landed, under instruments. And a mechanic found there was a valve had broke, an exhaust valve broke in the engine. He says, I can't believe this engine continued to run for another 25 or 30 minutes after this valve broke. He said the engine would normally just disintegrate. And that's another story. And then there's another story flying down from the States with another student of mine who we lost our navigation signal going to Tapachula, Mexico. Anyway, in bad weather, and she's flying the airplane and following the Pan American Highway up close to the mountains. It's raining, and she saved my life. I mean, it's interesting. She and her husband both, he was an Air Force liaison officer in Panama. And they took my ground school. He started taking flying lessons. Then she decided she wanted to start taking. She was the only perfectionist that I ever flew with. She wasn't satisfied with doing things that would pass. She had to do them. She had to do them to perfection. And of course, that instead of getting to 20 or 30 hours to prepare for flight tests, she had about twice that much time. And anyway, she saved my life in flying that plane, because she had to follow the Pan American Highway on the left side of the plane. We were in the clouds, and we had no navigation going to Tapachula, and it's incredible how oh man, I wanted to take control of the plane. She said, there's a road down there, there's a truck. I wanted to take control of the plane and just land in front of the truck so somebody would see us. And because we were low on gas, and that's another story. I mean, there's a number of other stories in that, and then there's some funny stories too that I tell in there. So there are a variety of stories mixed in with my job. I had an incredible job working for the Panama Canal Company. My office was right on the bank of the canal. The actual canal bank was no more than 30 feet from my desk, and I used to even nuclear ships submarines going into the locks would come right up to the bank. I could go outside my door and toss a softball to the sailors on the nuclear ship, submarines, and of course cruise ships. And then 3 or 4 days in the week, I'm out in the jungle with the Indians, monitoring rain stations on river stations. And it's interesting, one of the river stations we had a dugout canoe. We had actually about 4 boats that were cut out of a tree, about 40 feet long, and we put an regular outboard on them to go across the lake, and then going up the river, we put a jet outboard. And one of my remote stations was so remote, there was an Indian village, a Choco Indian village, across from where the gauging station was. And it used to be that any dignitaries that come to Panama, State Department, military, what have you, they'd see if we had a trip going up this river, because it was so... You're going out to National Geographic, where the women just wear a skirt and the men loincloth. And actually, I'd say I hired the only U.S. government worker that went to work topless, a young lady that was 15 years old, to take a sample of water out of the river every day in a bottle of water, paid $1 a bottle. Anyway, beautiful young lady. And I get accused of the guys in the office, you picked the prettiest girl in the village to take a water sample for you. But anyway, but sometimes I'd go out there and spend 3 or 4 nights when the lakes were full in the end of rainy season, and to measure a flood in a cable car going across the river. And I'd take a crew out, but I always took stuff for the Indians. Kerosene, the chief, I met the chief, and I said, what do you need, chief? Well, cooking oil, kerosene. I could use some 22 bullets for my gun. And of course, cookies and candy for the kids. And then they adopted me. And I showed them how to make popcorn with that popcorn. They used to, tin foil, some blah, blah. And when I go up there on a day trip, the kids would hear the motor in the river, and they'd run down the bank because they knew I always had cookies and something. And it's interesting, I was probably the only foreigner that was accepted by the village. I was invited to participate in all their activities and mingle with them, take all the pictures I want. And whenever somebody said, hey, Ed, can you get me a parrot, a baby parrot? I asked, hey, Chief, can you give me a parrot? Well, I'd go up, and a week later on the trip, and there'd be a parrot tied to my boat. Oh, yeah, I want them. Can you get me a baby monkey? And wood carving, they crude wiring, or they'd always have a gift for me when I went up on my day trips, because I just took care of them. And that's in my book, describes about the way the Choco Indians lived. And then the Cooney Indians lived out on the islands off the coast of Panama. And they were quite different. But all this has described a life that still goes on today. They live just like us today. The women never leave the village. They don't have shoes. All they wear is skirts. The men have pants on when they go into town to get supplies or things, but other than a loincloth. But it's funny. I have a picture of this guy. I used to buy gold from him. I taught him how to pan gold out of the river, and then I'd buy it from him. And I got a beautiful picture of him in a red long loincloth. And I said, I suspect this guy of carrying a concealed weapon. And it's so funny because he was evidently well endowed, because he had his loincloth. You could see that anyway. And then I would teach in the afternoons. The rainy season I love best. But and like I say, my techniques were different from other instructors, and I am so grateful for this, and they're grateful too. And I get comments on Facebook that people that went on to continue flying that said grateful for the instruction they got, because they never got anything like that from instructors in the States when they returned. Some of my toughest students, hardest students, were military what I call heavy equipment pilots, transitioning, and especially C-130 pilots. And the C-130, they land the airplane by an instrument they call angle of attack instrument. And one that doesn't have anything about guns or anything. It's just an angle of attitude, really. It's an attitude that they land the plane up 10 degrees or 20 degrees angle of attack, so they nose high, and they fly the plane to the ground. Well, when flying in our planes, you got to flare out. You go down and then you flare out to land. And I said it was easier for me to teach a basic student to to teach them how to fly than some of these heavy-duty, high-time pilots. You had some of them at 8,000, 10,000-hour pilots, and
fantastic stuff. Guys, you know what I love about all of this? Is that we have discussed so much information, yet we've barely scratched the surface. There's still so much left to be discovered. Amazon is where you have to go. Unusual Attitudes, Flight Instructor Memoirs is the title you have to pick up. And Edwin D. Armbruster is the author you have to thank for bringing it to your table. Edwin, this has truly been a pleasure. Thank you once again for being a guest with us today on People of Distinction.
It is really my pleasure. I enjoy telling my stories, and I appreciate this chance to let people know about my book.
Writer's Branding.